This video will cover the topic of reading and interpreting data from graphs. Be sure the date and topic are at the top of your page. The essential question for this video is, how can we read a graph to tell a story? We're going to take a look at a graph. I'm going to post it up here, and I'd like you to go ahead and make a sketch of it in your journal. The graph will show the number of laps a student has run in Mr. O'Neill's PE class. Be sure to pause the video to give yourself enough time to record all these points of data. The first thing we always need to know when we are interpreting a graph is what our variables are. By looking at the graph, we can see our two variables. We have time and we have the number of laps. Take a minute to record which of these is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable. We can see that the number of laps the student ran was dependent upon the time he or she had to complete the run. Therefore, the laps is dependent. It's on the y-axis over here, and the independent variable on the x-axis is time. Now we can use the data and create a table. Sometimes we like to create tables that match the graph. Know that at times we need to estimate some of these values. I'm going to start the table, but then I'd like you to go ahead and complete the table on your own. As you can see, our table is going to record the number of minutes that have elapsed, as well as the number of laps that the person has run. Chances are we'll have numbers that are slightly different. Go ahead and estimate what value you think the person has run after 1 minute. Right? We know, of course, it's 0 at 0 minutes. Go ahead and fill in what you think the numbers are that match the graph. How'd you do? If you did it on your own, chances are we have a few numbers that are slightly different, and that's to be expected because we're estimating a bit. In fact, if your table looks exactly like mine, I might assume you just copied mine. So make sure you have numbers that are the ones you believe are correct. Now, as we look at a table or graph, we can start to develop a picture of what happened. I'm going to flip back to the graph just so I can see the visual and see how I can use the graph to figure out the story that is being told. I'm going to start by looking at the graph here. In this part of the graph, the dots are staying the same. What do we think happened here when there was no change in the number of laps? It seems as though this is showing us that the students stopped for a period of time, right? They did not increase the number of laps that they ran, so they seem to be just stuck at 18. Now, we don't know why that occurred, right? Maybe she needed a break, maybe she was tying her shoe, maybe she stopped for water. We don't know the reason, but we can see the event. The event is that she stopped. We can also tell by looking at the graph where the student made the most progress and perhaps the least progress. Right? We can see in a graph that she made the most progress when the space between the graphs is greater. If I were to imagine a line connecting these, right, it wouldn't always be the same line, right? We can see it's flat here. The steepest part of the graph is where the student seems to be running the fastest. So right here, where it's steep, this is where she's running the fastest. On the other hand, we can see she made the least progress right here because the points are pretty close together. So with the exception of where she was stopped, this seems to be her slowest moving pace, right? This is where she's going the slowest. And we can tell this just by looking at the graph. The graph tells us a story. She started off pretty steady. She went a little bit slower here. She sped up again until she stopped. Then she continued on at a pretty good pace. And at the end, she seems to have sped up. So remember, the essential question for the video was, how can we read a graph to tell a story? We just had an example of reading a graph about laps in PE, and there are a couple of key things that we saw. We like to look for places where the graph remains flat. In this case, it told us that the person stopped running, right, because their distance or their laps did not increase. So that's one thing to look at. We also like to look for places in the graph where the graph is steep, and that can mean that the coordinate points are really far apart from each other, so to connect them would require a really steep line. We also want to look for places where the graph is less steep. So for example, this coordinate point and this coordinate point are really close together and not very steep. Those are good clues to look for that will help you to tell your story from the graph.